KZN's Police Commissioner Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi has found himself at odds with labour unions after suggesting that unions' demands for wage increases has resulted in a decline in government workforce numbers. Speaking at a stakeholder engagement on crime prevention with Premier Thami Ntuli, General Mkhwanazi stated that unions were making it difficult to hire additional staff, demanding higher salaries for workers. Now, joining us to discuss these statements and the subsequent criticism from unions is Labour analyst Patrick Deale. Good afternoon, Patrick. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Now, the statement by General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi has caused a storm. It most certainly isn't a new debate, though, because that assertion that labour unions demanding higher wages causes unemployment is a long-standing debate, where those who hold such conservative views, if you will, have continuously perpetuated that position. Just your reaction, though, to those statements or those utterances from the General.
Yeah, good afternoon to you, Mpunde. Look, I mean, just as a general proposition, that's the cut and thrust of wage negotiations and the ability of unions to negotiate collectively for their members to get the best wages, the best terms of conditions, and that's just the way it works. And so, you know, if the General is talking about that, and he goes further to say that the unions, presumably he's talking, I'm not sure which union he's talking about, whether it's just the police unions or all unions. But anyway, if it's even just it's the police unions, it doesn't help to manage the relationships between management or the employer, the police as the employer, and the unions representing their workers with this kind of statement that is made. I think it's unnecessary to make a statement like that. It's ill-timed, and it doesn't really help to create a trusting relationship with the unions who they have to deal with in one way or another.
What of those who argue that such a debate, pardon me for interjecting there, but what of those who argue that such a debate must be had? I mean, the Democratic Alliance has held that view as a political party, especially around the minimum wage, for the longest time. Some say it is a debate, a healthy one that must be had, because Capital honestly believes at times that it's better to have salaries than high salaries for a few. But that maybe here in this instance, the problem is who the speaker is, as you say, that given that he's a senior, he's among what we would consider the employers in any institution, that here it would possibly cause that rift between labour and management within the police force, given his seniority. Is that the case where perhaps it's just who spoke, not necessarily that this conversation doesn't deserve to be part of public discourse?
That's correct. That's essentially what I was referring to. And of course, any debate, any dissenting opinions, particularly on issues of labour economics, supply and demand, what system of economics you're going to apply at a macroeconomic level, and other government and civic institutions, of course, is healthy. And these things must be talked through. There are arguments, and the arguments can be made, they can be considered and reasonably accepted or rejected or modified in some way. I mean, I think it's absolutely right. But somehow this has sparked a particular spot in the police force, it seems to me, made by this individual who happens to be in the limelight for his other, whistleblowing or announcements that he's made about the corruption that's going on the police. And so there's a kind of dry tinder in the entire environment, and everyone, I think, is on edge in the police anyway about conditions of work and employment relationships. So bad timing from that point of view, in that sense, I would say.
Now that you touch on corruption, some say that perhaps it's time that we had an honest conversation or debate around the extent to which corruption has contributed to unemployment, because we see there a misdirection of funds from essential development projects. But somehow you find that in our very communities, there are those who protect those who are corrupt, who benefit. Sometimes you find that a corrupt individual in one instance is said to be a philanthropist in certain circles, even though they continuously take from government. And then you have this cycle where it leads to unemployment. How much of attention are we just placing on the extent to which corruption has contributed to the unemployment levels?
Well, I would imagine, I mean, I don't have statistics or anything, but I imagine it's played a huge role in unemployment, because it creates an alternative system of running the economy, where you have people above the blue line, in other words, those playing by the game, going by the rules, the legal systems and so on, using the proper institutions to run businesses, to run state institutions, etc., and those below the blue line. And those are criminal syndicates. They may be clinical at the same time, but criminal syndicates who infiltrate the systems and undermine all of those who are trying to operate above the blue line, as it were. And of course, it undermines all the efforts of those who are doing the right thing, attempting to grow the economy, allocate money to where it should be going properly for a proper end to achieve particular results of growing institutions, of providing services, and thereby providing jobs. Mm-hmm. But if you've got other people who are working against it and basically stealing the money, you're undermining their efforts, and that creates a greater pool of employment, and then creates people who then go below the blue line and start getting involved in corruption themselves because they can't feel as if they can get into the organized traditional employment place.
Mm-hmm. Because that becomes the real back and forth. Every time we have interviews with municipal unions where some say that is really the site of quite a lot of corruption, the unions would say every time when it's time to discuss wage increases that you have society that feels that they're too greedy, there's moratoriums on salary increases, and they're saying the ordinary employees at the bottom are made to suffer when these municipalities are not delivering and they're no longer financially viable, whereas it's those at the top who make decisions, perhaps those in procurement, that have actually benefited from a level of corruption because they sometimes is some sort of a parallel state here. That for instance, the procurement of police uniform, it could cost 10 rand, but there would be inflation where it costs 20 rand. They don't know where the money is going as those employees at the bottom. But then when time for salary increase, a mere amount, then they're told, no, there's a moratorium on salary increases.
That's exactly right. And you know, those complaints are valid. You know, if there is corruption, and as I said, if the corruption at the higher levels are done in such a way for greed and, you know, to feather their own nests and improve their own situations, it comes at the cost of not only the efficiency of the organization, the ability of the organization to fund itself, but it also threatens the sustainability of the organization. If it threatens the sustainability, it threatens the jobs of employees, not only to pay decent wages or increases in wages, but also their jobs themselves. Mm-hmm. And so it is like, you know, kind of cancer that spreads throughout. You know, it's a rot. And if the rot is not removed, it just gets worse because more and more people say, well, what can I do? I must join the rot. And once you get, you know, a majority of people kind of thinking in terms of the only way to make it in life anywhere is to get involved in the bad stuff that hangs on. I mean, that goes on. And that's a vicious downward cycle of corruption, which we absolutely have to, you know, we have to get our hands on and to stop it. You know, otherwise there's no control because it happens unseen. And those in power with authority to oversee and to enforce the law, if they are not, you know, with deliberation getting onto those cases and doing them, and otherwise taking backhanders or getting involved in themselves, then we are in real trouble. And there's indications that that is happening. Mm-hmm. And so we basically lose control of the management of the civic society, the civic institution, the government institutions, and so on, if that happens. And it has to be stopped. No question about it.
A very important point that you make, that this corruption happens unseen, but what becomes visible is the inability to fill vacancies such as those in the police forces we're seeing now when we desperately need more men on the ground. But Patrick, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That's Labour analyst Patrick Deale there speaking to us.